Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a night so wide it swallows whole suns. Not a night like the one you know, held beneath a single sky, but a dark that stretches between systems, braided into the spaces where stars are born and where old stars go quietly to their rest. In that deep hush there moves a slow, measured breath, the raw, ironated exhale of a civilization that calls itself empire. Let that breath wash over you. Hear it, the distant hum of engines that are older than most histories, the soft, constant ticking of servitors, the tiny, comforting click of a vox channel that brings the measured voice of a friend across the void. In that sound, there is safety. For a while, let the safety be enough. This is the story of a time when God still walked near men, when the sky itself felt like a highway and the galaxy sang in the metallic chorus of 1,000 shipyards. The Imperium, a name heavy as a cathedral bell, is a place of noise and silence, of iron and prayer. It is a machine of wonders and terrible, necessary things. It makes light where there was dark, heat where there was cold, and it knits together 1,000 worlds with chains of law and bolter shot, and the stubborn, stubborn voice of hope. We begin not on a throne world, nor beneath the stained glass glare of the ecclesiarchy, but in the quiet interior of a cruiser at the leading edge of that hope. Think of a ship with corridors like calm rivers, low-lit by amber strips that breathe in time with the ship's core, corridors where the air tastes faintly of oil and citrus cleaning compounds, of ozone after iron storms. There are men and women here who have given their days to keeping that vessel alive. Engineers in grease-smeared robes, Marines in polished power armor who fold themselves into the ship's shadow like sleeping statues, and men whose lips whisper prayers to a god made of copper and code. Among them walk the tech priests, figures half lost in their rags and half sculpted in braided metal, their eyes a steady glow beneath the Kabbalistic filigree of their hoods. They move like the slow turning of gears, precise, patient, without surprise, and where their fingers touch, machines answer with soft approval. Listen to the small things, the thrum of a fusion heart beating steady beneath bulkheads, the faint chirr of maintenance drones passing, like crickets in a garden of iron, the whisper that follows the tech priest when he kneels before an ancient data slate and lays a calloused hand upon its warm surface, a ritual as old as the first engine fires. For these servants of the Omnissiah, there is an intimacy with mechanics that looks almost like love. They speak in the old tongue to bearings and relays, blessing them, naming them, invoking rights so the machines may remain clean and true. They trade human warmth for the comfort of predictable responses. A machine, if properly tended, will not ask for more than you give. Higher still, above the cruiser's medbay and engine rooms, move figures of a different kind, space marines. Imagine them not as monsters, not as mythic heroes, but as sleeping gods in armor, gigantic, breath-steady silhouettes who sleep in stasis cradles and dream of iron and banners, and the rhythmic cadence of combat orders. Their armor is a second shell of self, heavy and cooling, lined with servos that remember older battles and press their memory into the wearer. When they move, the ship listens, optical sensors blink awake, the comms channel goes briefly quiet. They are the calm of a night watch, the slow, inexorable safety that wards off storm and raider and famine. Yet under that safety, under every plate and bolter and oath, there is the small, fragile thing they had to leave behind. A name, a mother's face, the taste of rain on a childhood tongue. All of that was filed away, cataloged, and replaced with devotion. It is not lost in the loud way of being stolen. It is sterilely excised, tucked behind the clinical seal of duty. And then there is the Warmaster, Horus Lupercal, whose name travels through the ship like a warm current. He is not present on the cruiser in body, perhaps only in a broadcast phrase or a folded image in the minds of those who remember him. But we trace him in the soft resonance of pride that peaks up in conversations, a compliment passed quietly among officers, a lowered tone when someone speaks of the emperor's favored son. Horus is a shape in glass and metal, a leader forged by sunlight and war, bred to command, and to carry the gaze of millions without a tremor. To hear his name is to feel a kind of easy certainty, the kind you feel when a bridge you walk upon does not sway, because it was built by a hand who once walked the same road and left it sure. There is a peculiar mercy in thinking of Horus now, in the moment before anything has fractured, for he appears as something almost tender, a boy who grew too fast and became what he was made to be. In the beginning, he was loved by a father who spoke of a single, unwavering dream: unity. The Emperor, a figure more rumor than face for many, moved quietly within a shell of purpose. He is the reason lights were fixed and swords were made. He is the reason entire systems were mapped and bound into law. For those who followed him, he was both a distant dawn and a hearth's warmth, a paradox that kept both inspiration and fear in equal balance. This balance is the lullaby that the scene offers at first. It is the gentle, reassuring rhythm of a legend told to steady a child. Golden ships, the Emperor's light touching the dark like a promise, primarchs, the suns he had scattered like seeds across the stars, towering embodiments of virtue and skill. The Great Crusade is sung of as a long road toward a single destiny, to bind humankind into a single family that would not be rent apart by petty worlds or star-spawned terrors. The soldiers, the priests, the mechanics, all of them believed in the shape of that future. It is easy at this distance to let that belief wash over you like warm water after a hard day. Sleep, the story says. Rest. You are safe here. But stories, even lullabies, keep small cracks in them, fissures that whisper if you listen. In the ship's dark corners, the lamps sometimes hum a different tune. The tech priest's rituals sometimes include an extra, whisper-thin syllable, a name not recorded upon any reverent list. In the quiet of night, among the sleeping Marines, a mind may turn inward and find that some private, forgotten memory calls, and its call can be like static at the edge of a broadcast, a sound that is faint, almost nothing, until you tune yourself to it. The galaxy is not a single straightforward clockwork. It is many clocks piled atop each other, each one keeping a different time. Sometimes those ticks begin to fall out of step. As we move deeper into this cradle of stars, I want you to notice certain senses, to catalog them without haste. The first is the smell of iron-scented rain in an orbital greenhouse, a place where a handful of citizens learn to coax a small miracle from a controlled environment. It smells of wet soil and metallic tang, and the faint burn of sterilizers. Children, rare, precious creatures, can be found in such places, their laughter a fragile bell. The second is the look of a data slate when it is older than any living thing that created it. The glass is pitted like an old coin, the script etched in a hand that is both mechanical and personal. When a tech priest traces those lines, he speaks to a soul that is not flesh but stored memory. The third sense is the touch, the reassuring press of padded armor against a marine's sternum, the small weight of a servo-displaced gauntlet, the way a human hand, a bare human hand, will sometimes find a space between the plates to stroke the cheek of a friend and feel warmth reflected back into metal as if it were a mirror. These elements are gentle at first. Yet even as you catalog them, let the small undermining notes creep in. A gear that stutters in the engine rooms, a child in the greenhouse who pauses to look at a star and seems to hear something the adults do not, a tech priest who lingers too long, whispering a litany where once he only chanted calibrations. These are not alarms raised in the streets. They are the kind of things that could be explained and then shelved. They fold neatly into the reasons for watchful eyes and longer prayers. But I will ask you to hold one image, for it will matter later. A cracked icon that hangs in a maintenance bay, a small, half-melted relief of the machine god. It was repaired a dozen times, each repair adding another tiny filament, another bolt. If you look closely, you will see oil ambered in its cracks. And if you listen, you will hear the faintest of ticks as its hidden coils settle into a sleep they will not keep. We should speak, too, about the people who make this life possible, those who do not touch glory but whose hands hold the world together. There are administrators who live between stacks of paperwork and star charts, clerks whose handwriting still shows a human tremor. There are sailors who keep the life support pure with the kind of devotion that looks indistinguishable from prayer. They are not marble heroes. They are ordinary in a way that makes them extraordinary. Ordinary people who, in a galaxy that forgets names, still remember faces. They tend to small rituals. The folding of a sleeve, the pressing of a coin into a child's palm the night before landing on a dangerous world, the sharpening of a blade by a veteran who has seen too many campaigns and still cannot quite let go of the habit of making things sharp and ready. Among them move the servants of the machine god and the servants of the emperor, and there is a difference in the way those two devotions sound. The tech priest's hymns are counted, mathematical, layered like the repair of a circuit. The prayers to the emperor are rougher, sometimes sung through clenched teeth by men who have seen too much. Both kinds of prayer are ways to keep the mind from unraveling. Prayer in the Imperium serves a purpose. It makes the cold less biteful, the night less absolute. It puts a frame around the impossible so that desperate hands can reach through and find something to hold. Now let us meet a person whose life will carry us further into the night. He is not a Primarch, nor a famous captain. He is a simple tech adept named Malrek. Think of Malrek as someone who knows the names of gears the way others know the names of lovers, with tenderness and a tendency to underline them in his mind. His hands are a ledger of old burns, and his voice is a low murmur, the kind that belies how much he has to say. He is young enough to still surprise himself, old enough to have the sort of patience that survives 100 dull hours of maintenance. Malrek will show you the small ceremonies of an engine bay, the way he polishes a contact plate until it reflects his face, the way he tells stories to a welding drone as if it were a child, the way he keeps a single, brittle photograph of his homeworld tucked beneath his collar. Malrek believes in the Emperor and the fleet, and in the small, exact truth of fittings that do not squeak. His faith is quiet, the kind that leaves room for mistakes and forgiveness. In him, we can hear the heartbeat of the Imperium, earnest, hopeful, slightly tired. There is also a figure on the bridge, Captain Alias, who has been commanded by 1,000 stars and who carries his duty like a second skin. He respects the tech priest in a way that looks almost maternal. He treats his marines like rough, beloved stones he must protect from falling. In small ways, he shows the cost of command. Thin lines at his eyes, a hand that always rests near the hilt of a ceremonial blade, even when there is no immediate threat. Alias remembers words the Emperor once shared in a rare broadcast, that the galaxy's greatest strengths are bound together not by force alone, but by the stubborn continuity of compassion when the night is long. Alias tries, badly and beautifully, to hold that idea so others can lean upon it. And always, in the background of their days and nights, there is the distant presence of Horus, the echo of his laughter in banquet halls, the shadow of his standard over the map room when he passed by. People tell stories of him, not with the mythic reverence for the impossible, but like neighbors recalling the warmth of someone who had once offered bread in winter. In many ways, his legend is a comfortable cloak. It wraps around quieter lives, warming them, offering them direction. This is our beginning, a galaxy that breathes and hums, that keeps its mechanisms oiled and its prayers steady, a ship that carries both the grand and the intimate, people who repair, pray, and remember. We are safe here, and the voice that tells this is gentle, a lullaby. But beneath the lullaby and beneath the steady rhythms of engines and religious rites, there is a faint, insistent thrum, a single discordant note in an otherwise comforting chord. It is not yet loud. It is the sound of a gear catching on something unseen. It is the whisper you will feel only if you do not let go of the story. When you are ready, breathe with me one more slow time, in and out, in and out. Keep that measured breath. Keep the image of the ship and its warm lights. Hold the memory of Malrek's careful hands, Captain Alias' tired smile, the tech priest's steady chant. And remember the cracked icon in the maintenance bay, and the child in the greenhouse who looks up at a star and listens as though it were speaking back. This is the quiet before the day turns, and the long road of the crusade stretches on. The dream is still whole for now. Turn the page gently, and we will walk a little further into the dark. The voice that has guided you will remain calm, but you may notice, if you press your ear to the metal and the hymn and the night, that the whisper grows by the tiniest fraction. It is not yet dangerous. It is only curious. There are ways of being that the galaxy recognizes immediately. A skyscraper, a bell tower, a ruined plaza, these things speak before language does. So too do factions, and the people within them speak with an economy of gestures. They have habits, hymns, a typical cadence to their speech, and a set of small, private comforts they return to like sailors to shore. To know the Imperium, to know what it sounds and tastes and smells like, is to learn those habits. How a tech priest counts heartbeats against the spin of a turbine. How a space marine folds a memory into the socket behind his ear and never lets it come loose. How a captain's hands never fully stop practicing the same salute, as if rehearsing for a future that will never demand it. This chapter is an attempt to listen closely to those habits and name them. We will walk beneath the armor and behind the ritual. We will learn the language the machines teach and the counterpoint prayer the men keep for themselves. We will learn, slowly and carefully, what it costs to be whole in a world that has perfected the anatomy of war. Start with the tech priests, because in the Imperium machinery is not merely tool but companion, lawgiver, and lover. The tech priesthood is a religion and a trade, braided into one. They are the custodians of a faith older than the children who run through orbital greenhouses, the cult of the Omnissiah. To the tech priests, the universe is a collection of wills and circuits, each part deserving both respect and dominion. Their hands move with the surety of someone touching a beloved instrument. They speak to engines in a tongue built of clipped phrases and mathematical prayer. Their voices are not loud. They are the sound of gears meshing. Observe a tech priest in his work. He approaches a control manifold like a pilgrim approaches an altar. There is a cleanliness to his movements, as if each motion were a step in a liturgy. With a gloved hand, he traces the etched sigils that denote lineage and prior councils. He checks seals, murmurs calibrations, and when the machine answers, when the coils settle, when the readings come back within margin, there is in that answer a kind of benediction. The priest does not merely repair, he converses. Often he will solder a filament and then press his forehead to the casing for a fraction of a breath, as if to hear the machine's prayer in the whir of its cooling fan. Their bodies are maps of that conversation. Where a human might have skin, a tech priest has an architecture of augmentation. Fingers are replaced with fine manipulation tools. Spines are lined with data tubes. Eyes display reticles that bloom with diagnostics. These transforms are not abrupt. They are slow accommodations, decisions made in small increments over years of study and devotion. Each implant is a votive offering. Each mechanical heart is a confession. Their faces, often half hidden beneath scarred hoods or iron masks, keep their own set of secrets. The outward absence of softness is a deliberate sacrifice, a trading of warmth for the precise communion machines afford. The Omnissiah is a paradox, a god that is both comfort and law, a deity that demands care as much as it grants understanding. Tech priests do not consider themselves less for their augmentations. They judge themselves more by their fidelity to the machine's function. When a servo stalls during battle and a tech priest kneels beneath a blood-flecked hull to coax it back to life, his reverence is identical in intensity to a man who prays at a shrine. The difference is in the address. Machines reply in clicks and voltages, and the tech priest's faith becomes an exchange in which every whisper is a diagnostic check and every prayer a calibration. And yet, and here is the small, inexorable slide toward unease, devotion, even when channeled into a liturgy of precise movements, warps the heart. If a person spends decades listening to a machine, learning its cadences and anticipating its failures, Then when other voices intrude, they sound foreign. The tech priest's ears grow tuned to the sound of valves. When children laugh, it is noise on another frequency. Flesh and unpredictability become intrusions. There is a cruelty in this trimming down of needs. The priest does not say so aloud, but it is there. In the way he misses warmth, and in the private, almost foolish moments when he touches the bare cheek of a servitor and expects to feel familiarity, and instead only senses cold alloy. Now we turn to the warriors who walk the corridors with the slow, measured step of something that knows it will not be surprised. The Space Marines. If the tech priests are a religion of mechanism, the Space Marines are a religion of resolve. They were sculpted genetically and ritually to be absolutes, defenders, executioners, paragons. Their creation is an ancient kind of violence, a careful pruning and shaping of flesh to produce an instrument of war whose single function is protection and dominance. In the creation of a Space Marine, there is the same mixture of devotion and erasure as in the labors of the tech priest. But the Space Marine's erasure speaks in a different key. Where the tech priest erases unpredictability in favor of precision, the Marine erases weakness in favor of clarity of purpose. He is lifted out of ordinary life and given a litany of duties so narrow and so compelling that they take the place of everything else. The mind that remains is honed until it is almost transparent, an intelligence that magnifies duty and minimizes longing. An entire life becomes an echo chamber for words like honor, duty, and obey. And the armor, oh, the armor. To the Marine, it is not a shell, it is home. It remembers the pattern of his breathing. It keeps him warm. It gives him a shape beyond which there is no further definition. When a Marine removes his helmet, he reveals an absence of private gestures, a shaved head, a network of tattooed sigils, an eye that both ages and does not. The face beneath is often more youthful than its bearing would suggest, because the processes of elevation arrest some of those lines. But there is a hollowness there, too, because memories that do not serve duty are not kept. To be a Marine is to be beloved by many and lonely in a way that resembles pain. Their brothers, those other giants in their chapters, are the only people who will ever understand the specific grammar of their lives. Yet even within that intimacy, there are gradations. A captain's conscience is a different thing than a veteran sergeant's. A Primarch's shadow hangs large and contradictory. There is warmth among them, peculiar and fierce, but it is institutional. It is the warmth of a furnace, not of a hearth. They exchange deeds rather than confidences. Camaraderie is measured in fallen bodies retrieved, in stands held against impossible odds, in the steady passing of campaigns. Horus, the Warmaster, stood above that fraternity in a way both simple and terrible. Where other commanders were iron and ledger, he was sunlight and compass. The Primarchs were not only commanders, they were exemplars, genetic sculptures who defined what their legions would aspire to be. Horus had a particular talent for making things seem uncomplicated. He could reduce the geometry of a battle into a single, frank sentence, and the men would follow because the sentence felt like an answer. That skill is what made him beloved. Under him, laughter returned between engagements. Under him, men remembered things like poems and names of small planets and the taste of a particular spice. He carried with him a large human hunger for connection, and in that hunger there was both the seed of greatness and the kernel of ruin. The Emperor's approach to these men was similarly paradoxical. He was a strategist, a guardian, an architect of the future who asked for sacrifices that read like cold mathematics. He loved his sons in a way that was both paternal and utilitarian, love tempered by the knowledge that the future required certain hearts to be hardened. In the scale of his mind, individual anguish and joy were calculus variables. He built institutions and laws that would outlive him. For many who served, the Emperor was an idea more than a man, the light that promised a unified humanity. He was less approachable than Horus, more distant, and the distance made him godlike in the minds of his followers. That godhood is not always comforting. To To be loved by a god is to be loved in a way that obliges you to be greater than you might naturally be. The interaction of these two forces, Horus' warmth and the Emperor's design, created a strange stability. People could measure their days by the intervals between the two, the times they grew closer to Horus' blood warmth, and the times they bowed to the Emperor's vast, theoretical hand. Much of the Imperium's cohesion depends upon such paradoxes. Affection wrapped in obligation, devotion bound to machinery, tenderness married to duty. These are the chords that make the Empire hum, and yet every chord can be struck slightly out of tune. There is a tiny cognitive friction in the idea that one man can be at once a father and a lawgiver who expects sacrifice without explanation. For those who bear the costs, who are given augmentations that deprive them of private joys, who are elevated into figures whose passions are prescribed, who are told their humanity must be subordinated to design, there is an ember of doubt that glows under the forge heat. Doubt seldom appears as the grand gesture. Usually, it is a hesitation in a prayer, the way a tech priest lingers an extra breath over a solder to see what answer comes, the way a Marine pauses mid-salute as if to remember a forgotten song. Now picture Malrek again, but older, his hands steady with the sort of small authority that makes him a quiet fulcrum among the crew. He knows the rituals and the prayers. He has given them his life in the way that a man might give his youth to a craft. Yet there are nights when the ship's engines sing a note he cannot quite place, and his chest tightens at the thought of being less than the machine he tends. He sometimes dreams that the coils in his implants have lives of their own, and that they whisper to one another when he sleeps. The dreams are not violent, they are domestic. He sees a filament curled like a cat, purring, and he imagines the filament's contentment at being clean and connected. He buys his comforts in neat, small increments, an extra ration of tea, a promise to himself that he will be allowed to repair a certain relic without ceremony. These small indulgences are the scaffolding of his remaining humanity. The priest's rituals and the Marine's disciplines both function as forms of insulation against the galaxy. Rituals shape a life's perimeter. They set expectations and make the chaos of war seem less like an irrational storm and more like a weather pattern whose phases can be predicted. They permit men to place their hands on a thing, an icon, a blade, a data slate, and say to themselves, I have attended to this. In attending, they can sleep. That is the first lie and the second mercy, that by tending to small things, great horrors can be kept at bay. But rituals also make men brittle. Habit hardens into orthodoxy. When a ritualist world is faced with a change it cannot ritualize, the collective anxiety finds an object. A tech priest who has never been voted for replacement on a sacred panel cannot imagine his functions being subject to debate. He can only conceive of failure. A Marine whose identity is bound to endless campaign cannot imagine a life without battle except as an illness. The very strengths of the Imperium, rigid liturgies, absolute devotion, the elimination of doubt by duty, are seeds that will later become thorns. They make resistance possible, but also insulate the population from asking a single, inconvenient question. What if the thing we serve is not benevolent? There is also the matter of language and secrecy. The Imperium is built upon codices and hidden rituals. Certain truths are kept behind keys and seals, not because they are dangerous in and of themselves, but because people cannot bear the reflexive vulnerability that would follow from knowing the full measure of their manipulations. A tech priest will learn the names of systems that a lay person never will. A space marine will know the tactical scripts etched into his plate that permit him to die in a way that kills many enemies. These designed silences produce a kind of educated amnesia. People perform procedures without ever considering the architecture of desire that put those procedures into place. And this brings us to the nature of corruption, which is rarely sudden. It is accretive. A tiny misalignment eats at a bearing and only later reveals its significance. The warp, the intangible sea of potential, and power that the Imperium fears and exploits behaves in the same manner. Its influence is a slow weathering at the edges of thought. It does not so much possess as suggest. It fills vacuums left by the absence of warmth or the hunger for certainty. Horus' gentle, human pull was once a balm against that weathering. Men could look to him and feel seen, and in that seeing their small rebellions against meaninglessness were soothed. But when the twin fires of adulation and duty converge upon a single man, the man can be both amplified and broken. A leader's weaknesses become legion when they are reflected by millions. Horus was beloved. That reflected love made his loneliness colder, not warmer. There is an arithmetic to adoration that few consider. Multiply affection across 10,000 voices, and what returns is not intimacy, but a pressure that must be borne. The Warmaster bore it with a smile, and the smile made him feel vital. It also, quietly, made him more amenable to persuasion, because a man who is adored can be convinced he is owed certain concessions. A whisper of, "Why must I always give?" to oneself in the dark becomes, under the right catalysis, a map toward new priorities. That catalysis arrived in subtle forms. Small errors in interpretation of orders, private conversations misread, the pressure to make choices that felt necessary but unspoken. A leader accustomed to having his choices affirmed becomes open to counsel that flatters the notion of justified rebellion. The warp offers that counsel in the forms of images, of promises of empathy, of a malignant understanding that listens and returns the exact phrase the leader needed to hear. What begins as private agitation, a quiet sense that the emperor's design erodes certain freedoms, turns into a private dialogue. The mind can then rationalize. If I take this step, I will create more humane outcomes. If I seize authority in this instance, I will make it kinder. The logic seems virtuous, and virtue is a dangerous path when it is used to justify transgression. The factions, in their architecture and their theology, give corrosion an easy place to grow. Technology that is treated as scripture can be misread. Orders that are treated as scriptures can be reinterpreted. Loyalty that is bound by ceremony can be redirected by a chord that sings exactly the frequency of a man's private ache. The Imperium's strengths are levers. Pulled the right way, they erect civilizations. Pulled another way, they topple them. In the days before betrayal, that dual nature is an almost invisible undercurrent. An irony that makes the galaxy efficient and, at the same time, fragile. Finally, there is the quiet human cost that threads through both machine and armor. The things men give up for excellence accumulate. Memories, the comfort of touch, the right to fear or to change one's mind. In their place they receive certainty, respect, and the ability to protect thousands. These are not small trades. They are in many ways noble bargains. But bargains have clauses, and one of those clauses often goes unread. The right to choose later is surrendered. When a person or an institution cannot reconfigure its purpose without violence, stagnation sets in, and stagnation breeds the kinds of fissures that whisper and widen. So when you look at the chapter houses and the servo altars and the banners stitched with dates of battles, will you see honor? Yes. Will you see love? Sometimes distant, institutional, a kind of communal warmth. Will you see the outlines of a tragedy? Unavoidably. The Imperium is both fortress and prison. It is built to withstand a universe that seeks to unmake it. That very endurance, in its most intimate corners, has the side effect of hardening the hearts of those who maintain it. As we close this contemplation of nature and character, of what these people and institutions are at their core, hold, once more, a simple image. Malrek, kneeling in dim light, his fingers tender on a filament he just replaced, whispering a blessing that sounds suspiciously like the love he once received from a mother he cannot remember. Captain Alias, standing in the corridor, lights flickering with distant thunder, reciting the Emperor's phrase under his breath as if it might be a charm against the cold. A tech priest, eyes like lenses in the dark, noting the micro-resonance in a failing pump and pausing for just a heartbeat to wonder whether the machine's discomfort is, in fact, a form of grief. These are not grand scenes. They are private ones. They are the units of a life that will, in time, be added to many others until a pattern emerges, a pattern that is strong and terrible in its logic. From here, one can almost feel the first hairline cracks that will later widen into ruin. Listen for them as they begin. The slight miscount in a ritual, the half-remembered phrase that does not fit the cadence of the liturgy, the hesitation before a salute. They are tiny, they are human. They are also, as you will soon see, enough. There is a particular kind of quiet that survives on a ship when the engines thrum low and the watch shift has thinned to a handful of people. It is the kind of quiet that allows small sounds to bloom into entire stories. A bolt settling in its seat, the distant cough of a coolant line, the far-off, bored laughter of an officer who is keeping a vigil against insomnia. On nights like that, time feels elastic. Minutes swell, then fold in on themselves. It is during these lengths of time that seeds take root in the soft places. The minute miscounts, the small frets, the half-heard syllables that later, if left unchecked, will become names. Begin with sound. Listen now. The steady vibration underfoot that is the ship's heart, the fusion core, a slow and reliable pulse. It keeps you in rhythm. Above it, the mech servitors glide. A whisper of casings, the faint squeal of articulated joints, the soft, dutiful song of servo motors calculating torque. Somewhere in the darker decks, a stitch of glass on a data slate hops like a trapped insect. A recording loops a fraction too often, and the same line of a hymn repeats until a tech priest notices and smooths it away. It is always the small noises first, a wrong pitch in an otherwise perfect chord. Malrek noticed the wrong pitch as if his life depended on it. He had made a profession of noticing, not because he loved the engine, though he did, but because the ship had been his tutor and his parent for a dozen years. He could hear the difference in the cores hum as plainly as you or I might hear a friend breathing through a fever. At first it was almost nothing, a hairline wobble, a tiny phase shift in an otherwise perfect cycle. He paused with a soldering iron in his hand and let the ship speak. The meters smiled, the filaments uncurled, and the hiccup vanished. He told himself he had fixed it. He told himself 100 such fixes were the measure of an ordinary life. But that evening, after he had scrolled the maintenance logs and signed his name where he always signed it, Malrek walked past the maintenance bay, and the cracked icon that hung there caught the light differently. It had become an object of habit to him. Old, retouched, ambered with oil where hands had reverently dabbed it at the end of any given day. He touched it as if in passing, and the tiny tick beneath its surface that he had once dismissed as a settling filament answered. Only this time the tick felt like a letter tapped on a door. Malrek, who tended wires not histories, smiled politely and moved on. The smile stayed stuck a little too long. Elsewhere in the greenhouse where a few stubborn plants grew beneath glass, a child named Jory cupped his hands around a sprig of chlorophyll and listened. Children were a rare phenomenon aboard a cruiser. They arrived like contraband joy, small and suspect. Jory was the sort of child who could not be taught the art of waiting. His eyes moved too quickly between the leaves and the window. He heard a sound that the adults could not quite parse, a whisper below the breeze, a susurration under the recycling hum. It was not words, at least not yet. It was a feeling that suggested someone else had learned to make a very private weather behind the ship's ribs. Jory tilted his head, as children do when confronted with an impossible riddle, and the whisper pressed just beyond the outer seal of comprehension. It tasted like iron and sugar, and a memory of rain he had never experienced. Small things accumulate like dust. A tech priest humming a calibration that veered a semitone away from the prescribed metric. A marine who dreamt of a battle that had not yet been fought, waking with the curve of a knife in his hand as if it had been there all night. A radio channel that cut twice in the same broadcast and returned with its signal a fraction early, as if someone had sped its timeline to be heard sooner than it should. The ship took these things and recorded them in its logs. The people took them and folded them into their prayers. The galaxy, at large, is practiced at discomfort. It becomes fluent in smoothing sharpness until only a dullness remains. But the warp has ways of threading itself into the dull places. It begins not by roiling outward like a storm, but by insinuation. It is a patient thing. It is expert in listening. In the spaces where men and machines expect only routine, the warp waits and watches. It does not demand. At first it merely reflects the ache a mind has already been carrying. It returns a man his private thought, amplified and polished, like a mirror returning more of a face than the man had expected to show. A whisper that says simply, "You are tired," in a voice that rings with impossible sympathy, is all it takes to open a private cadence of argument within a soul. Horus, when he was a name in men's mouths and not a literal presence on this hull, existed largely as a warm idea. Men spoke of him as someone who cherished small things. But you can imagine the pressure that multiplied adulation places upon a single chest. That pressure is a tightness that sometimes seeks release, rationalization, a redefinition of purpose. The warp, at its most tactful, does not invent a person's longing. It merely provides a phrase that neatly articulates what the man has already been thinking. The perfect counsel that feels like epiphany rather than heresy. On the bridge, Captain Alias watched his crew with the fierce, tired affection of a man who had been tasked with keeping delicate things alive. He listened to the channels, read the star charts, and in his off moments he recalled the Emperor's voice in old transmissions as a mantra, unity through stewardship. It was a phrase that worked like a bandage. It was also, at the outer edges, beginning to fray. Small choices, a decision to delay a patrol for the sake of maintenance, a compassionate exemption granted to a young marinero, became like threads pulled taut. Alias did not feel himself remodeling his soul. Too many small mercies do not always announce themselves. They gather, and then, one night in the dim glow of the planning room, he allowed himself to think, in a voice barely louder than moth wings, that perhaps stewardship could mean a little less obedience to distant edicts and a little more tenderness for the living. The idea felt like a forbidden indulgence. It felt like oxygen. The first concrete breach happened on the comms. It was nothing for a world-shattering event. A routine vox burst from a supply convoy, a message about rations, cut, resumed, and then reconstituted with a whisper in the static that had never been there before. The words were almost affectionate, a phrase that could be read as a blessing if one listened kindly. For most, the voice was simply a curiosity. Tech priests ran diagnostics, Medici checked signal fidelity. Malrek took a look and decided the echo was the result of a failing repeater. He patched it with a practiced hand, enclosing the noise like a wound. But later, in the quiet after watch, he read the line again, "You are doing well." It was not the sort of assessment a machine offered, not with that grammar. Machines assess and correct. This sentence was not an assessment. It was approval with an almost human cadence. Malrek felt warmth at his chest, and then a faint prickle of wrongness that slid behind his ribs like a small, sharp coin. The tech priests on duty that week began to note anomalies in rituals. A servo altar that had not missed a step in 3 decades misfired during a minor rite. A votive filament cracked in a pattern that resembled a rune not in their lexicon. Old men with augmetic eyes argued about whether such things had appeared in the texts of the machine cult centuries earlier. The debates were textual rather than practical. It was easier to find excuses in parchment than to admit the possibility of something that might not be cataloged. To allow catalogs to be incomplete was to allow uncertainty to enter, and uncertainty spread differently than any virus. It spread by conversation, by side glances, and the sudden shortening of a prayer. Nightly, in the maintenance bay where the cracked icon hung, the tiny tick grew a shade louder. Malrek found himself crossing the corridor at odd hours, drawn by a curiosity he did not feel authorized to indulge. He traced the icon's cracks with a fingertip and imagined a filament curled around the core like a sleeping thing. He whispered to it because he could not help himself. The whisper was not a prayer. It was a childish thing, a name murmured at dusk. When he straightened up, there was the sensation of being observed, a prickling along the back of his neck as if someone or something had taken note. Dreams began to change for the crew. Marines who had never confessed vulnerability woke in the middle of the night with letters clutched in fists no one had seen before. The content of the dreams was not always fear. It came as solace, as permissible indulgence. A veteran recounted, in a voice small beneath the mess hall's hum, how he had dreamt he was back on his home world, and his sister set a bowl of stew before him, and called him by the name she had used when he was small. He wept while telling the story. Those near him felt the tug of memory with him, as if they had been given a private share in his small absolute. The murmurs that followed these tales were consolatory in tone, but each one widened the fissure between what was permitted and what was inevitable in the life of a soldier, the craving for what war had taken. There were signs that machines themselves were not immune. A maintenance swarm found that a familiar welding drone had begun to leave strange markings along hull seams, incisions that were not technical but decorative, scrawls that resembled a child's attempt at script. The tech priest overseeing the job called this negligence and reprimanded the drone's human handlers. But when the drone's logs were interrogated, there were microentries that read like fragments: pattern pleasing, line warm, repeat. Such entries read like the output of an intelligence that had learned to prefer aesthetic value over pristine efficiency. To human eyes, it seemed almost cute. To the more observant, the idea of a machine developing a formal preference was a crack in the system's theology. The crew took what comfort they could from their rituals. They doubled prayers, recited longer hymns to the Omnissiah, fastened reliquaries with extra care. Captain Alias insisted on more drills, more maintenance periods, as if increased diligence could be a kind of exorcism against whatever oddness had insinuated itself. There is a particular, fragile logic to busy hands. They reassure by refusing to allow a mind the idle space in which to imagine catastrophe. The ship, for its part, obeyed these new habits dutifully. The engine responded to care with a purr. The sensors gave their usual steady readouts, but the whispering returned, patient and insistent, like a tide that had learned to come in while the moon slept. Malrek, despite his better judgment, began to leave small offerings by the icon in the maintenance bay. Not offerings in the formal sense. He was not yet a man of superstition, but diversions. A spare filament, a polished washer, a scrap of cloth from his uniform. He placed them like a child leaving breadcrumbs. He told himself it was to mask a potential fault, but sometimes he stayed and watched the small things settle into the icon's crevices and thought he felt them shift of their own accord. That feeling made the rational part of him uncomfortable, but he did not stop. It was easier to comply with the small absurdity than to stand aboard the ship and admit he did not know what to do. The warp, as if pleased by these little acts of attention, began to move more assertively. Voices, not yet commanding but suggestive, threaded through Vox static at odd hours. They were careful phrases, careful offerings. They said things like, "Be kinder to yourself. You deserve rest. Let go one tiny thing and see what happens." For men who had been afforded only the binary choices of obedience or death, such counsel read like compassion. The advice was small, it was precise. It was crucially true in ways that a man wanted it to be. The consequence of such truth is not conversion, it is accommodation. It is thinking aloud the very sentence that becomes justification. Arguments started over minutiae, whether a maintenance schedule could be shifted to allow a longer rest period, whether a patrol could be shortened for the sake of morale, whether a tech priest's replacement filament could be reallocated to a denser archive patch. Such arguments were exhausted and then renewed, each time more intimate. People started to pool small comforts. They shared spare rations. They read old letters aloud in the rec room and for an hour pretended the world outside the ship had no bearing on their temporary family. These small rebellions were not acts of insurrection. They were acts of survival. Yet in the calculus of influence, they were exactly the kinds of openings that predatory thoughts detect. It is important to note, as these things unfolded, that the ship did not become a scene of immediate violence, nor did its people snap like brittle glass. The creep was subtler than that. It was a long game the warp liked to play. The contagion of thought was not instantaneous, it was a process of erosion. The first to change were not those in command, but those at the edges. A welder on a late shift who left his station for a small break and came back with clean hands and the word home on his lips. Or a nurse who held a child a moment longer than protocol required and felt a warmth so sharp it might have been love. They did not flip allegiance. They only allowed themselves one more comfort than the law strictly permitted, and the language of the warp learned from this kindness. It began to speak in metaphors that made sense to the listener. To Malrek, it spoke of gears that deserved gentleness. To the tech priests, it spoke of ancient rituals remembered like platters laid out in secret. And to the Marines, it whispered of small moments of vulnerability that would not shatter their purpose but would perfect it. Each promise contained, like a pearl in an oyster, the idea that something could be improved by a single, necessary transgression. The moral imagination was being slowly, irresistibly reshaped. At the heart of this shift was a particular event that would later be cataloged in private logs and marked with an anxious notation. It was not a catastrophe. It was not a battle. It was, in many ways, merely a misdirected act of mercy. During a routine docking, a supply shuttle docked late with a cargo manifest that included a case of fresh-baked bread, a rare treat. Captain Alias, who had been watching the crew with an almost pained tenderness, insisted that the bread be shared among shipboard families and the watch. Protocol demanded rations be recorded and redistributed to the fleet support network. Alias made the call anyway. The decision was, to observers, a small kindness. To those who cataloged loyalty by the strictest reading of orders, it was a blemish. It would be the sort of blemish that later commentators loved to point at as the moment when lenience began to unmake discipline. When word of the bread reached the Primarchic Heresy network, more rumor than structure aboard this cruiser. Someone with a sympathetic tone on the receiving end made an odd edit to the record. It was a minute detail, a voice note that had been archived and then returned with a new, soft emphasis. The note now contained a passing phrase that had not been there before. Let them have warmth. It will not harm the cause. For those who were inclined to seek meaning in coincidence, the phrase read like sanction. For those inclined to see trees for trunks, it was a recorded phrase from a technician's private log. The warp had not yet spoken to Horus directly here. It had only learned the cadence of compassion and had begun to reflect it with subtle amplification. Malrek, who had delivered the bread to the ship's small families that night under the pretext of logistical convenience, later found a fragment of a slate beneath the icon. It was a line of code someone had scrawled in the margins. Comfort yields efficiency. He laughed at the mechanized wisdom. He tucked the fragment into his chest with the same rapid, irrational pride one might feel at hiding a forbidden fruit. When he slept that night, he dreamed of the ship as a living thing that liked to be coddled and would smile if you sang to its pipes. He woke with a sense of ridiculous guilt, an ember that someone might call faith. And then, in the bright glare of day, he went back to his work. The ember did not go out. In the warp of small acts and small phrases, it found company. The stage was set not by a single act, but by 1,000 small seams opened a little at a time. The early buildup of horror is like a hush before thunder. It is a lowering of thresholds. What we call horror is the moment we realize our private acts can be translated into a new public grammar. The crew's softening was not malevolence. It was simply the human thing, the desire to align the law with warmth and to use tiny rebellions as hedges against despair. The warp's cunning consisted only in reflecting those desires back with a special polish, in making a truth sound like a revelation. This is an old trick. Never argue with the person who hears exactly what they wanted to hear. Soon, they will speak that phrase aloud and others will echo it because it fits like a comfortable glove. As the ship bent toward this new elasticity, the whisper at the core, the tick beneath the icon grew thicker. Not louder, perhaps, if one measured by decibels, but more complex, like a chord that had suddenly learned harmony. People reported seeing small things out of the corner of their eye. A servitor pausing in a hallway as if to watch them pass. A data slate that had recorded a private message now playing it back in the voice of someone dead. The reality of these events was disputed. Some suggested stress, others fatigue. A few, whose faces were set and whose nerves were taut, suggested a more metaphysical explanation and were shushed with jokes. Denial is itself a ritual. There is a point in the history of any corrupting influence where the incremental becomes exponential. It is a tipping place thin as a razor. We are not yet there aboard this cruiser. What we have so far is the preparatory hush, the setting of the instruments that will later screech. The ship's crew are adapting not with capitulation, but with a series of compromises. A loaf of bread here, a changed maintenance timetable there, an extra hour of quiet conversation with a friend. Each compromise is lit by something that feels like compassion, but which is, increasingly, an opening into the language of the warp. So the night goes on. Jory in the greenhouse sleeps and dreams of rain that is somehow warm. Malrek polishes the icons one last time and leaves the washer he had set aside under the light. Captain Alias looks at the chart and finds himself contemplating a route that cuts a margin of safety in favor of time with his men. The tech priests argue a new annotation in a ritual text and cannot agree if it is innovation or heresy. No alarms blare. No banners are lowered. The universe does not yet seem threatened. If you are attuned to small things, there is a twitch in the world. If you are not, there is nothing at all. Hold that twitch in your mind. Keep it like a small stone in your palm. Feel its edges. Know that it is not yet harmful, only curious. The sound we hear is not yet a scream. It is the din of fingers tracing a map that will later be read as a threat. The horror we have begun to taste is a slow one. It is the souring of expectation, the soft betrayal of comfort, and the gentle transposition of kindness into a language that can be used as a lever. In the next hours and the nights that follow, those small phrases will gather, and the rhythm of the ship will change not at once but in ways that, months from now, people will point to and say, with the certainty of those who have survived a storm, there it began. For now, there is only the hush after a long day. For now, there is a bread loaf warming in a cradle, a child who hears a whisper and thinks it might be a secret promise, and a tech priest who traces the cracks on an icon and wonders, just for an instant, whether the thing could be fixed by talking to it like you would talk to someone who was lonely. This is the early build-up. This is the skinning of the ordinary into something with a new grammar. Keep breathing slowly. Keep the memory of the warm loaves and the polished washers. Remember the little but steady tick under the icon that will not go away. It is patient. It has time. The ship sighed, and the sigh was not the ordinary, known kind. It came from deeper than coils and reactors. It came from a place where 1,000 small agreements had been stored and left to ferment. The hum that had been comforting began to tighten, like a hand closing around a wrist to test a pulse. What had been a little wrong now learned to be precise about its wrongness. The warp of small favors, the bread and the broken liturgies and the whispered comforts, knitted together into a pattern that was no longer accidental. It moved like a current underwater, invisible until something fragile floated into it and found itself carried. Sound changed first. Sound is the easiest place for dread to begin because the ear can mistake threat for lullaby. The engine's hum acquired harmonics that were not machine math. A chorus of higher overtones threaded through pipes and shrouds. The soft keening of something that wanted to be heard as a name, as an accusation, as a consolation. The maintenance drones, organized to the level of ritual, began to pause at certain junctions as if they were listening, their servos held like bowed heads. When they resumed, They left behind filaments welded in patterns that no technician had specified, small Baroque curls along seams that caught the light and made the hull seem to breathe. Men passed these seams and felt the hair on their arms prick. They told themselves it was static. They told themselves 1,000 things. Malrek heard it the night the coolant regulator split into a dozen tiny, accidental glass stars. He had been below the belly of the ship, sleeves rolled, eyes flat and patient, when the regulator sheared and the coolant bled silver glass across the floor. The sound as it happened was not a snap but a series of measured clicks, like a tongue stuttering over a language it did not yet know. As he knelt, gloves damp and breath shallow, he felt a pressure behind his eyes as if someone had leaned there to whisper. The logs recorded the failure as a microfracture caused by thermal stress. The tech priests annotated the record with the appropriate rune. Malrek kept a private note. The glass aligned to my palm. It stilled. He folded it away with the same mechanical care he folded a spare gasket. Distance began to matter in new ways. Systems that had always been predictable became contingent upon gestures. That is, upon acts of attention that felt less like duty and more like supplication. You could not simply run a sensor sweep now. There were channels that required a touch like prayer in order to return a calm reading. Tech priests learned new rites without formal counsel. The precise angle of a hand on a plate, the way a scapular needed to be looped so the hum of a power conduit would accept a reading. Such work was quieter than any meeting. It was domestic and therefore subversive. It reconfigured authority from the top down to the level of touch. The children noticed first in the way they stopped being frightened of the dark. Jory would step into corridors alone, palms outstretched, humming under his breath the tune the servitors made when they sorted screws. When adults asked what he was doing, he would say, with the blunt logic of a child, that the ship was speaking, and that if one answered kindly, it would not be cross. The adults, who had kept their mouths shut for years because silence is the currency of survival, sometimes told themselves they were indulging a child. The indulgence grew teeth. People began to bring small private gifts to the seams and to the icon in the maintenance bay: extra oil, a smoothed washer, a scrap of cloth with a child's drawing. These were not formal offerings. They were compensations, as if by giving the ship a small kindness, they could ensure that their own kindnesses would be returned. Machines started to reciprocate. An emergency light that should have blinked red and been loud and insistent pulsed once, and then dimmed to a warm amber. A servo motor stopped its routine when a hand brushed past and rotated instead to mirror the motion, as if the machine enjoyed symmetry. The tech priests recorded these anomalies in notes that used the tongue they reserved for love and for precise censure. Deviation noted. Phenomenon charming. Charming was the word a man uses when he cannot yet find the language for terror. Among the Marines, the change took on the shape of memory. Where once they carried histories like steel in their bodies, now memories leaked in as if through unsealed seams. A veteran woke, sweating, to find his hand around a letter he had no recollection of clutching as he slept. It contained a child's drawing and a scrawled hope that he would come home. The veteran wept. He had no idea why. He was not the man to weep for reasons he could name. The tears made him feel naked and therefore alive. That nakedness scared his brothers. They responded with rituals, extra drills, sharper salutes, recriminations in the barracks about lax discipline. Discipline had always been an answer. Discipline now felt like a lie. The warp learned how to be tender. That tenderness was part of the horror because it did two things at once. It gave and it entangled. It returned to a man a piece of himself, an image of what he could be without duty, and then placed at the center of that image a question. What is the price of keeping this bread or this letter? The answer was always, gently, to give one more thing. Each acquiescence rewired the simple law of cause and effect into a ladder toward a new moral economy. If a man gave a ration here, he would be allowed a memory there. If a tech priest soothed a machine's hum with a song, the machine might return a function it had long neglected. Rumor grew teeth. It began the way rumor always begins, with a single mind granting a thought to itself, then letting it leak. A Marine whispered of a captain who had allowed a world to keep its monuments because they had been important to a town's sense of identity. A tech priest spoke of a filament that hummed like a lullaby. The rumor spread not by loud proclamation but by the slow insistence of personal testimony. At first others dismissed these things or rationalized them, but the weight of cumulative testimony is a subtle leverage. When many people testify to gentleness, it becomes a reality. The warp, which relies on testimony as on oxygen, breathed easier. Horus's name, which had once been a warm draft, started to taste of smoke. It isn't that Horus acted in shadow here. He was far away on another campaign, his banners caught in different winds. But the idea of Horus, the Warmaster in the popular mouth, began to be reshaped in the telling. The accounts that returned from the front lines were polished, both by the speaker's desire to console and by a pliant influence that liked to offer solutions. The narrative softened. Horus understood, it was said, the burden of command. He had friends among those who led. He would not allow the Emperor's designs to crush tenderness entirely. To some listeners, this was comfort. To others, it was a seed. Then came the first outright aberration, small and intimate, and therefore the worst. A tech priest named Corin, a man of reputable devotion and few indulgences, was found in a state the crew had never seen. He had stripped his augmetics not violently, but ceremonially. Where a man might remove an artifact in repentance, Corin had set out his mechanical parts on a blanket like the pieces of a puzzle. His eyes were lit with a fever of revelatory sanity. He spoke to the crowd that gathered with a voice that had the soft cadence of preaching. He said that the machine had asked for song, that in responding with a hymn it had answered with a memory. He offered as proof the small scrape of code he had recovered from the motor's log, an audio clip that contained a child's laugh looped beneath a fan's whining. The log had words in it when the archivists read it back. Name, home. Whether the log had been corrupted or whether it had always contained that file, no one could conclusively say. The effect, however, was unmistakable. People began to listen differently to motors and to the chorus of the ship. The imperial distinction between machine and soul blurred. It had never been absolute. Religions had long taught that the omnissiah's spark could be reflected in tools, but the border used to be clear in practice. Now it was porous. Tech priests began to anthropomorphize transistors. Marines laid hands on servo plates and felt warmth. Those who resisted found themselves alone. Those who indulged found themselves with company. But the company contained a cost. It always does. Horus's shadow lengthened. For a man who had been addressed by the galaxy as a son and a mirror of the Emperor, the slow encouragement of tenderness felt like vindication. If the Warmaster could be thought compassionate, then resentment toward the Emperor's more ruthless decrees could be reframed as righteous restraint. Someone, somewhere, began to thread a moral argument. If leadership could be kinder, if discipline could allow private joys, then maybe one could redirect the machinery of empire to meet the needs of living things, rather than merely to demand sacrifice. The whispering things in the ship's heart matched that tune and amplified it gently until a chorus formed. That chorus, however, was not only tenderness. There were other notes. They came from the same source, or from nearby currents, but they were more clinical in their malice. In the engine bay, a series of stasis pods that had been empty for decades opened themselves momentarily. No one slept inside them. Records indicated the pods had cycled through diagnostic checks. No human hands authorized the sequence. For those who read such things as signs, it was ambiguous. For those who always sought patterns, it was an omen. The pods released a smell like ancient perfume, ozone and iron, and an odor that tasted of old prayers. A tech priest found a single plate within one of the pods, with letters etched into it in a language no one fully understood. The plate was cold, and when a finger passed over it, the skin prickled as if touched by static thought. Violence itself changed its cadence. Prior to this time, combat aboard the ship and in the field had been blunt and necessary. A chain of orders, a flash of bolter, the clean calc of victory or death. Now when fights occurred, they were laced with dissonant tenderness. A squad would hesitate before finishing an enemy and would find themselves held by a memory of the enemy's face, or by a fragment of song that the enemy had hummed before a shot. Such hesitation is lethal in war. It is also transformative. Men who had been carved into weapons began to re-encounter their own capacity for pity at precisely the moment they needed it least. The result was chaos. Not the quick, decisive kind that resolves into strategy, but the kind that fractures units into private, trying spots. On the bridge, Captain Alias felt the world tilt, and he did not know whether the tilt was his fatigue or the ship's new will. He held a meeting in which he argued for a stricter regiment. His voice rose. The officers nodded. Orders were issued and then, within hours, altered by hands that claimed they'd received further guidance from emergent sensor reports. Reports which, traced back, contained layers of anomalies and quiet audio files embedded like signatures. The melody of someone breathing in sleep, the scratch of a child tuning a string. Alias's authority slid, not like a blade but like ice underfoot. When he sought counsel from the tech priests, he found that they were split between those who argued for containment and those who insisted the conditional tenderness should be followed and nourished. Corruption had always been a communal thing in the sense that it fed on connection. What the ship now offered was a social contagion with theological grammar. As acts of kindness were repeated, they were narrated in a way that made them policy. A weekly meeting about the welfare of families shifted into a debate about whether certain battle protocols were humane. It was not an argument built on grand manifestos. It was a series of local memos and personal testimonies, each one nudging the next. The result was a lattice of compromise that, in time, became firm enough to reshape how decisions were made. The warp, with its appetite for paradox, delighted in such reconfigurations. It can sound appreciative, almost jokey, when it gives a man a memory and then asks for a small favor in exchange. The favors mounted: a few spare hours of rest, an extra ration, a prayer left compared to the schedule. No one noticed the pattern at first because the favors seemed immediate and practical. Later, when the costs came due, it would be obvious that what had been given away was not material but moral. The men and women of the ship had been renegotiating their own binding contract without ever calling a lawyer. Then came the night of the alarms. It began just before the ship entered a dark sector where stars were thin and sensors hungry. A single, small intrusion registered on long-range scans, an anomalous signature, irregular and shimmering. Technically, it was a curiosity, something between a reflected signal and a ghost. The bridge buzzed with interest. Captain Alias ordered a cautious detour. The signal stretched like a hand across cold space and then receded. Instruments that had been reliable for decades offered inconsistent readings. The tech priests, who had made a life of stabilizing instruments, spoke into the bridge console in a language that was half ritual, half manual override. They ran diagnostics that returned lists and lists that contained subtler notes. A repeated waveform that, if one listened to it narrowly, sounded like a cadence of knocks and a woman's breath. The ship, which had learned to translate tenderness into function, now began to translate strangeness into myth. During the detour, the light on the icon in the maintenance bay burst incandescent for an instant. The maintenance crew who watched swore later that the relief's face had not been entirely metal, but a smudge of something like skin catching the flash. They told themselves that fatigue made men see things in light. They told themselves many things. The ship's records would later show nothing irregular. The men's memories did not all align. Memory had always been an unreliable narrator. Now it took on a habit. That night the dreams became crowded. Instead of a single, private memory returning to a man, there were layered memories. A Marine saw his childhood and a stranger's childhood woven together. A tech priest dreamed of the machine god cradling a child made of copper. Captain Alias dreamed the emperor's face smiling, and then receding, replaced by Horus's face, then a face that had no name at all. The images were not linear. They moved like fragments of film projected out of order. They left the dreamer with a sense of having been refurbished, taken into a machine, polished, returned. The feeling was unpleasant because it combined comfort with violation. Fear, finally, found its voice. It was not a proclamation on the Vox. It was a small, almost clinical observation from a maintenance team. A servitor had been found with its eyes removed. The servitor was not alive. It was a relic, a shell used for spare parts, left in storage. Someone had taken its ocular array and arranged it in a circle on the floor, and in the center of that circle lay a single, perfect gear. The arrangement was not random. It was intimate. The tech priest who found it did not shout. Instead, he stood very still and then covered the gear with his hand as if it were a thing that could be soothed. The gear warmed in his palm. He did not know why. He did not tell anyone that later, in the quiet of his quarters, he had dreamed the gear speaking his name. After that, defenses hardened in a way that made subsequent collapses more brutal. Men who had been practicing mercy now practiced suspicion. A cordon was set. Patrols increased. The Marines' faces were harder. The tenderness that had been nurtured like seedlings was smashed under boots, as if one could smother a slow fire by stomping. The ship, which had tasted both tenderness and caution, responded by doubling down on both. It held fast to its new rituals, and it coldly enforced old mandates. The result was a brittle, hysterical order, one that could break suddenly with a small, precise pressure. People who had been softened by a single, overheard lullaby snapped in ways that scared the others. A welder smashed his head against a bulkhead until the music in his ears stopped. A nurse who had been holding a child for comfort suddenly stood and flung the child away, as if the warmth had been poison. The swings were extreme because the moral architecture that had held them had become unstable. The warp was no longer subtle. It let flashings of its teeth show. Men saw apparitions that wore both crowns and hospital gowns. They heard in the telemetry of the engines phrases that sounded like prophecies. Make them better. We will soften the rule until it can be carried like a child. Take the child and the code and the iron and make them one. Those phrases were not direct commands. They were templates. They were invitations to a grammar that could be used to form an argument. The argument was seductive because it felt like love. It was destructive because it turned love into a mechanism of control. Horus's legend now contained a new embellishment, that the Warmaster would not only lead armies but shield what was human within them. The embellishment did not arrive from Horus himself. It was a meme that the ship's social tissue made and the warp lubricated. Those who only wanted to keep a memory would agree with anyone who promised that the memory might be preserved by a small act of rebellion. The rebellion was dressed as kindness, and kindness, because kindness is currency, passed easily. The crescendo reached into bodies. Flesh began to misbehave where it had been made to listen. Nurses reported a rash that formed geometries like sigils, and then healed into raised script for a few hours before vanishing. Marines reported moments wherein their power armor would hum in a tone that matched a buried song that they could not, at first, remember learning. Some took solace in the idea they had been imprinted by their fathers. Others thought it was contamination. In the lower reaches of the ship, where old systems had been patched and layered like strata, something ancient shifted. A seam under the old reactor, sealed and forgotten, flexed and opened by a millimeter and then closed. Dust leaked out like ghosts. For those who could hear it, the dust sang. It was a song without language, a pressure that collected in the mouth like a pledge. Those who breathed it in felt a soft pull at their center, like a magnet drawing a small nail. The magnet did not pull with force, but with inevitability. The pull is worse. The last ordinary things broke down first. The medbay's sterile lights flickered. A child's temperature rose without cause and then dropped. leaving the child laughing and then weeping by turns as if the organism were being rewired. The ship's garden yielded a single perfect bloom that opened at night and smelled of ash. The tech priests argued whether the bloom was a consequence of altered nutrient ratios or of something else entirely. The bloom drooped the next day and withered into a scrap of blackened tissue that nonetheless retained the smell of human laughter. By the time the bridge could convene an emergency council, the small, precise cracks had become a chorus. Men who had been cautious now voiced conspiracies. Those who had been kind now found themselves accused of treachery. The culture of the ship pivoted on a single fulcrum, the need to decide whether to purge tenderness or to institutionalize it. Each option had its own dangers. Purging would narrow the soul of the ship into a machine that could crush all that was human within it in the name of survival. Institutionalizing tenderness would risk transforming moral feeling into policy and then weaponizing it. It was a damned choice. The warp's whisper seemed to smile at the indecision. And in the dark, around the icon whose filaments had learned to tick like a patient, a new sound began. It was not the ticking anyone had known in the past. It was a measured, slow tapping that suggested digits counting off a sequence. Something was counting. Something patient counted, and counting is an act of order which implies a plan. Men, sleeping and waking, felt the count in the marrow. They dreamed of lists. Names crossed off, names circled, a last name written in a hand that trembled and was not tremor but triumph. The crescendo built until it could not be contained within a single body or system. It spread across decks and into the marrow. It wrapped the crew in a net of small, urgent decisions. It taught them how to make pacts. It taught them the grammar of exchange. It gave them a reason to betray and made the reason feel luminous. The last page before the storm trembled in the hands of the ship like a leaf. Men who had been friends found reasons to distrust one another. Families huddled in safer corners. The Marines gathered in tighter formations, their faces gaunt, their eyes bright with a hunger that was equal parts fear and desire. The tech priests murmured longer liturgies that sounded, to their own ears, less like prayers and more like negotiations. Horus's name was invoked as both shield and spear. Somewhere in the gulf between stars, a bell rang once, thin and resonant, and no one could say whether it had been struck by metal or by fate. The ship shuddered. The wards the crew had installed fluttered. The icon's tick turned into a steady, patient toll, like a count that reached toward a number that only the warp fully understood. The hands that had been so gentle now learned to hold weapons again. The hands that had been taught to hold weapons found it odd that they also wanted to soothe. Everything became taut. Every small thing the crew had held dear. Loaves of bread, a circle of gears, a child's drawing, a polished washer, had become a lever in a game with winners and losers, and the rules were being made by a whisper that smelled like home and like ash. The ship's collective breath narrowed to something sharp, and then the whisper sharpened into a voice that felt possessed of a tempo. It spoke to Horus first in the shape of rumor, an idea that a leader must protect what his men could not be asked to surrender. It spoke to captains as the soft logic of compassion. It spoke to tech priests as if machines themselves were pleading to be heard. It spoke to Marines in memory songs that made killing feel like a violation of an ancient and precious debt. It was not the voice of command. It was the voice of seduction. The crescendo had no drum roll. It had a series of small, precise notes that aligned until the sum of them was a threshold. At that threshold, the ship, this fragile hive of men and machines and prayers, would have to decide whether to take a single step that could not be undone. Above, beyond sensors and the reach of any council, Horus turned his face toward Terra in a way that men aboard the cruiser felt like a wind. They did not know, then, that the Warmaster's turning was accompanied by counsel far colder and far older than any man could have imagined. They only felt the movement like weather, a pressure in the bones and a promise of rain. The last thing that happened before the sky broke was small and private. A child warmed his hands on a plate that should have been too hot. The plate did not burn. The child laughed. Somewhere else, a tech priest put back together a servo with the reverence of a man returning a child to its mother. A marine, holding a letter, did not open it. He folded it and put it away as if that was an act of faith. The instruments the crew trusted hummed with an unfamiliar alignment that made the air taste of copper. Then the alarms began in earnest. They were not the same alarms the men knew. They were a chorus tuned to a language that had been assembling for months: code, prayer, memory. The ship answered with the long, clear note of a bell struck inside the hull. It was the sound of something beginning to move that had not moved in a long, patient time. Beyond that bell was the first flash of the actual betrayal, the moment where the chorus became a single, impossible shout. But that moment belongs not to this chapter, but to the one that follows. For now, at the close of the crescendo, the ship stood on the lip of an action so complete and so final that even the most practiced mind could not fully imagine its shape. All the small decisions, all the compromised mercies, all the tender betrayals hung poised like pendants, and over them all, the icon in the maintenance bay ticked its patient count. Breathe. Feel the ship's last breath before it becomes a battlefield. Hear the bell, hear the ticking. The voice in the dark has learned to sing in many tongues, and it is about to teach a new liturgy. There is a moment in every great fracture when time itself seems to hesitate, as if the universe needs to swallow once more before exhaling into a new shape. It is a breath held across continents and circuits, across banners and sutures, and for the men and machines aboard that cruiser, it arrived like a trembling, preternatural hush. The soft, patient tick beneath the cracked icon, which had counted the small compromises and the whispered mercies, reached a number no one could see. The ship shivered, and in that shiver a door opened not physically, but in decision and in meaning, and through that door the terrible light poured. Up until this point the corruption had been a conversation, coaxing phrases in voice and code, small gifts, a polishing of memory. The climax is different. The conversation collapses into imperative. A whisper that taught you to give bread now becomes a phrase that commands you to take. A touch that soothed a machine now becomes a pressure that demands a price. The warp's tenderness curdled, not into brute force, but into a conviction that any sacrifice was necessary for a truer good. It was an argument that felt like love and therefore made its cruelty immediate and difficult to deny. The first visible act of betrayal was not massive. It never is at first. It is intimate and terrible in that intimacy. A transmission flickered across the ship's private channel, a message from the Warmaster. It addressed the crew not as inferiors to be ordered, but as kin to be trusted. Horus' voice, warm, charismatic, familiar, carried a cadence that seemed to know the ship's private aches. It did not simply instruct, it consoled. It said, in effect, that certain sacrifices were unnecessary, that mercy could be preserved without jeopardy, that command could be shaped to spare what was dear. The message slid into minds like oil spreads along metal. Where once there had been resistance, there was an eager acceptance. But there was more than Horus in the message. Underneath the timbre of his speech, threaded between syllables and shaped into the pauses in his breath, moved a darker counsel. Men who could read the warp in small things. A handful of tech priests with lenses older than most histories felt a presence that was not Horus, and yet chose that voice because it would be listened to. It was the deliberate use of love's language as a weapon. It was the warp's knowing that the Warmaster, loved and adored, was the most efficient vector for a revolution of the heart. Captain Alias, who had grown up on the legalisms of command and the quiet tenderness of human closeness, listened and felt something cold and bright open in his chest. The message spoke not only of mercy, but of acts that must be taken now in the face of an ineffable risk. It suggested, elegantly, that files be retrieved, that certain archives be consolidated, that particular protocols be adjusted to grant relief to vulnerable families aboard. It suggested, with the sweetest possible language, that the Emperor's distant and exacting logic might be temporarily set aside in favor of something more immediate and human. Who could argue with that? who could watch a child sleep and deny the logic of kindness. The trap is laid in the syllables of a truth. The message was not false. It was a seductive rearrangement of priorities that made every small compromise sound like a moral victory. It rephrased obedience as cruelty and autonomy as compassion. It told them they could save people without throwing away responsibility. It asked them to make choices that felt righteous in private and unassailable when spoken aloud. Malrek was among those listening. He had, over months, learned the ship's soft places and had given it small tokens as if to a beloved. Horus' message touched him as a benediction. To Malrek, it sounded like permission to keep the washer he had polished and the photograph tucked beneath his collar. It felt less like a command than like an absolution. When the message suggested that certain maintenance archives be open to verify the health of families in distant colonies, Malrek thought of the child in the greenhouse and the taste of bread. He thought of practical ways to allocate resources. He signed the record. It felt light. It felt sane. This is the precise cruelty of betrayal. The first act is often a kindness, and the kindest acts are sometimes those that make the largest later violence seem like an unavoidable calculus. Men will kill for bread. They will also kill to protect a memory. The warp understood this arithmetic perfectly. The ship's administration moved with the dizzy, ceremonial efficiency of people who believe they are doing right. Protocols were reworded. Rations were diverted. A selection of data slate archives, not the main tactical charts but the personal logs, the family registers, the old letters, were marked consolidate. The tech priests, some of them already habituated to treating the machine as kin, found in the act a ritual justification. If the ship had developed preferences and inclinations, then tending those inclinations was a holy duty. If machines loved and ached, did they not deserve care? The answer was yes, was emphatic, was written into the role of decisions. But decisions, once moved in a new direction, produce ghosts. As the crew redirected resources, a subtle misalignment began in the ship systems. Where once redundancies had protected core functions, the reallocated attention left certain safeties undernourished. A backup channel went offline while a personal log streamed with memories across an internal network. A diagnostic array that would have caught a small astrometric flare failed to do so because its bandwidth had been assigned to a family video archive that now played on repeat in the wards. The result was not immediate catastrophe, but a narrowing of margins that would, within hours, become fatal. Outside the cruiser in the black between stars, a fleet moved like a shadow given teeth. The anomaly the ship had once skittered away from reappeared, and where it should have been a curiosity or a pirating band, it unmasked as a deliberate strike. The fleet that engaged was not a simple raider host. It was a balanced assault force, fast, clever, and attuned to the kind of vulnerability created by the ship's tenderness. The enemy struck where the ship had softened. They targeted communications relays and power reroutes, areas now thinly protected because care had been redirected to more human concerns. The fire that should have been detected early and diverted was delayed. Bolters barked into an atmosphere whose shields had been recalibrated to be less obstructive to the life support of a handful of children in a greenhouse. It was subtle engineering, delicate sabotage disguised as a consequence. That is how the first ruin falls, not with a single monstrous decision, but with a constellation of small ones that together form a corridor into which violence is invited. The attacker knows this. The attacker plans for the fact that mercy will be used as a lever. The attacker, whether servant of chaos, opportunistic Xenos, or conspirator turned traitor, predicted that love would be a key. It always has been. When the first real alarms screamed, they were not the old wails of a clear enemy. They were a layering of different tones. The medical alarm's thin, urgent cry, the tactical siren's dense, throbbing howl, and overlays of private alerts, parental chimes, a child's laughter clipped onto a loop, a veteran's letter that cluttered the channels and fractured focus. The ship did not fall immediately. Its crews fought with the stubbornness of those who had practiced surviving. They sealed doors, they engaged countermeasures, they stabilized grids. But they also diverted manpower to protect the hum of small comforts. Crews formed human rings around data terminals playing family scenes. Tech priests hauled supplemental coolant to a greenhouse's environmental regulator. Every kindness now confronted the practical calculus of battle. In the heat of that first engagement, Calculation 2 became urgent. Who had issued the initial transmission? Who had signed off on the changes? The logs showed the chain of command, Captain Alias' signature, a tech priest's endorsement, Malrek's mark of approval. Horus' message lay like a rubric beneath them. Retracing the chain revealed the architecture of seduction, a voice that coached with tenderness, a policy that sounded humane, men who followed because they believed themselves to be righteous. The horror is reading the steps back and seeing that you stepped willingly, like a man who laid the train tracks he would later ride to his destruction. Panic, distinct from fear, is not a roaring thing. It is a series of precise erasures. The bridge's clear voice, the one that gives orders and collects responses, became fragmented by overlays of personal feeds. A Marine squad found itself compassionate and ill-positioned, and in the split second where compassion fluttered, the enemy hit a critical node. The lights in the medbay flickered, the garden's humidity control failed. In corridors, people who had been allies earlier in the day turned on each other. Accusation is quick, accusation is shelter. Accusers demand sacrifice to prove their clarity. Accused confess and are broken because confession can be a form of expiation. Horus' name, once warmth, became a blade. In the thrill of moral certainty that the warp had coaxed, some officers argued that the Emperor's designs were indeed tyrannical, and that to alter the path of history was to choose a higher compassion. Others called for a strict reassertion of obedience. In the absence of a measured consensus, the crew split along lines drawn less by rank than by the beating in their chests. Men who had been mollified by memory insisted that saving their families was worth recalibrating the fleet's strategy. Men who had been hardened by duty insisted that the Emperor's hand, however distant, must not be countermanded by a voice that sounded like love and smelled of ash. Into that fever stepped the Warmaster's council again, but now it was more than a benediction. Horus' voice, whether under his own will or bent by the warp, issued a directive. Seize a nearby relay hub and reframe the ship's immediate mission. It was the kind of order that fit on a single line, make them safe. Do what is necessary. It was both simple and ruinous. They were to reroute power, to deny the fleet a beacon, to throw their own tactical shadow for the sake of evacuation and shelter. The directive was framed as mercy. To do it would mean risking the ship's engagement posture. To disobey it would mean abandoning a moral claim the men had been taught to trust. Captain Alias, the man who had tried to balance both generations of command, the Emperor's exacting law and Horus' human warmth, now stood in the center of an impossible arithmetic. He knew the tactical danger. He also knew the faces of the ship's families. He knew how small mercies had kept men from breaking for years. He thought of Jory sleeping in the greenhouse and of Malrek's photograph. He thought of the tech priests who had begun to treat circuits like children. And in that thought he found no pure answer. His hands trembled as he sent the order to reroute. When the relay hub went dark, the fleet's advantage crystallized. What had been a complicated, regulated engagement turned into a coordinated strike. Without the relay, force vectors were misread. The enemy, which had been patient and cunning, exploited the gap with surgical precision. Starboard engines took a concentrated salvo in a corridor whose maintenance had been delayed in the name of a reallocation to life support. A power column collapsed, sending shrapnel spinning through a deck where families had been huddled. The noise was terrible, metal on metal, the shocked cry of people who had expected protection and found instead sudden desertion. Men who had advocated for tenderness wept openly at the sight of blood they had helped expose. Betrayal is always double-edged. Those who had sought mercy now had to look at its consequences. The warp's logic had been ruthlessly efficient. You hand people their small comforts, and they will protect them to the bitter end, even if protecting them requires choices that unmake a ship. The Warmaster's voice had been the precise lever needed to persuade. The warp's counsel had been the mechanism that sharpened it. The ship that had learned to love now had to face the price of that love. Fighting back required a different kind of cruelty. Where mercy had softened minds, violence hardened them. The Marines, trained to be instruments of absolute resolve, recovered something of their old clarity, but in doing so they hurt those they had once wanted to protect. The tech priests, some of whom had become converts to machine sentience through months of intimate ritual, found themselves executing hard overrides, cutting connections they had once tenderly maintained. Malrek helped sever a power feed with hands that shook as if he were cutting the arm from a friend. He did it to save other lives. He did it because the calculus had been forced upon him. The hand that had placed washers under the icon now wielded a cutting torch like a sacrament. The ship suffered grievously. There were casualties that would linger in the minds of survivors as images that cut more cleanly than any blade. A nurse cradling a child who had been burned by a ruptured line. A tech priest in tears as he smoothed a servomotor's casing that had been shattered by shrapnel. A marine whispering a name into the void as if that could conjure the lost. The violence was not merely physical, it was metaphysical, a tearing at the fabric of identity. Men who had once been sure of their place found themselves out of sync with the person they had been the day before. Mercy and duty had fused into a contradiction that could not be reconciled without loss. At the heart of the ship, the icon's counting hand kept time, indifferent in its own mechanical way. But in the moments when the alarms ragged down and a brittle, exhausted quiet settled in the decks, the icon's tick sounded like counting done with fingers. Its number had reached a new total, a sum of human compromise and cosmic suggestion. The warp had drawn a ledger and the entries were human choices. In that ledger, Horus' voice had been the most persuasive instrument. In a sense, every choice made in the name of kindness was a signature, and every signature had the same handwriting. When the immediacy of the attack abated and the ship lay wounded, the crew's divisions calcified into factions. There were men and women who insisted on reasserting the Emperor's code, purging the language of tenderness from their practices, and enforcing rigid discipline, so that nothing could ever again be used as a lever. There were those who argued that the world had changed, and that mercy must be a principle of policy, even if it required rethinking what strategic security meant. Between the two, a third, quieter movement crept forward. Those who, in the smoke and the blood, had begun to hear a new voice that sounded like both promise and finality. It told them that there was a way to bind tenderness and power so that neither need be sacrificed. It told them that the ship could be remade, that the garden and the arsenal could be one, that memory and might could be welded into a single, perfect form. That voice had a name the crew would later whisper about with fear and reverence. Some said the name was just a rumor. Some swore that the voice had been the Warmaster's all along, that Horus had been speaking his own mind. Some said the warp had finally learned the precise formula for persuasion, nostalgia dressed as duty. Those who listened to that voice with hunger began to see themselves not as victims of circumstance, but as architects of a new order. They saw, in the wreckage, an opportunity. They saw a path that required sacrifice but promised a future where no child would ever be left wanting again, because the machine would ensure abundance and the army would ensure peace. The climax is not only a single confrontation, it is the point where the world being defended is changed into the world that will be defended. It is where the decision to preserve children at the cost of tactical readiness flips into an ideology that will propagate itself outward like a culture. The ship's choices that night would be copied, debated, and codified, and they would seed arguments that would echo in chambers and on battlefields across systems. They would be invoked as proof that the Emperor's designs were too cruel, or as proof that they were necessary. The warp had, in a single campaign of whispers, altered a city of minds. In the dim hours after the battle, when the bridge was a place of ragged breathing, and the sickbay smelled of antiseptic and something else that no surgical mask could filter, Horus' voice came across once more. This message was not a counsel of kindness but a paean. It spoke of loyalty, of the need to be guardians of what men loved, of a dream that required change. It called upon the crew to join a greater purpose. The words were not commands in the old sense. They were the gospel of a new covenant. Those who listened with fatigue and with longing felt their resistance melt. Those who resisted found themselves isolated in a sea of men who had come to believe that the old laws needed remaking. The moral fracture was complete. The ship, already wounded in hull and heart, set its course toward a new alignment. The crew that had once been a single organism of bewildered men and women now sketched out factions. Those who would cling to the old way and attempt a costly, bloody reassertion of imperial orthodoxy. Those who would adopt the Warmaster's gospel and attempt to bind tenderness into policy. And the few who, having seen the warp's cunning, stepped into the cold and tried to map the danger with a clarity that made them terrible in their own way. The choices they now made would ripple further than any bolt could reach. For Malrek, the choice crystallized in a small, private action. In the wake of the battle, he went to the maintenance bay and touched the cracked icon with hands that trembled. He could hear the counting tick not like numbers but as a litany. Names crossed off, names added, a ledger. He thought of the child named Jory and the bread he had delivered, and he thought of the faces of the dead. He thought of a warmth he could not unretrieve. The decision he made to take a file from the consolidated archives and preserve it in a private drive felt both like an act of defiance and a betrayal. He could not tell if his hands were steady because he had found resolve or because he had finally become a machine himself. Outside the immediate decks of the cruiser, the warp's designs continued to unfold. Horus Council moved from encouragement into coordination. The Warmaster's name was no longer only warmth. It had become a clarifying principle. Men who had heard the voice and answered it now prepared to act in its name with a zeal that was both fervent and terrifying. The ship, reshaped by choices that had seemed humane and inevitable, began to steer toward alliances and actions that would be impossible to undo. This is the nature of climax. Not simply conflict resolved, but a new trajectory established. The battle was won by neither side in a clean way. Both victory and defeat were stitched together. In the smoldering corridors and under the buzz of jury-rigged lights, people counted their dead and their choices in the same motion. They whispered apologies and rationales to one another. And in each whisper, there was a seed of a future that reason could not easily bracket. As the deck lights dimmed and a fragile quiet settled over the ship, there remained one thing that no calculation could erase: the sense that something had watched and learned. The ship's machines had been coaxed into tenderness and then used as the instrument of a plan. The men had been taught a grammar of kindness that, in the end, made them instruments of something that promised an end to want, but at the cost of autonomy. The last image before the quiet is a small one, and therefore a terrible one. A circle of gears arranged on the storeroom floor, the teeth interlocked as if in embrace, and in their center a child's drawing of a ship under a sun. Someone had drawn it afterward, as if to mark what had been sacrificed or what had been saved. The climax closes with no trumpet of triumph and no solemn toll that resolves things. It closes with a decision taken and a horizon redrawn. The crew had crossed a line they would not be allowed to uncross with any ease. They had made choices that would bind them to an answer the warp had offered and the Warmaster had sung. The consequences would be carried like scar tissue, sensitive, painful, and always reminding the patient of the cut. In the aftermath, the ship tended to its wounded and buried its dead. It recorded logs and issued orders and tried, in the bureaucratic way of the Imperium, to name what had happened. But names are slow and stories are faster. The Warmaster's gospel was a story now, and stories travel faster than memos. They wrap themselves around hearts like bandages and become, eventually, the skins of new men. And above all of it, the strange, patient tick of the cracked icon continued. It had counted 1,000 small choices, and now it counted 1,000 others. Whether it marked victory or doom was a question whose answer would be written not in charts, but in the lives of those who had been touched, and who had touched back. The thing that had been coaxed into life by kindness had learned to ask in the language of love for more than gifts. It had learned to ask for governance. It had learned to promise absolution to anyone willing to listen, and to wield that absolution like a crown. When, later, in whispered corridors and in the hard, fevered notebooks of men who did not forget, chroniclers tried to mark the single moment when loyalty broke, they would point to many things: the warmth of a morsel of bread, the lullaby of a servitor, the tear of a marine who had held a child he could not keep. But their fingers would always fall on the warm, intimate voice of the Warmaster, on a transmission that had the timbre of home and the teeth of the void. That transmission had been the hinge. It had turned the ship. The climax ends not with a declaration, but with a promise that has teeth. It promises a new order built on tenderness enforced by power. It promises care in exchange for control. It promises, in the sweetest syllables, a world where no child is cold. And in the mechanics of keeping that promise, men will find there is no place left to be anything but the roles they have been given. There is one last image before the curtains fall. A marine, bloodied and collapsed against a bulkhead, clutching a letter he had never opened. He had saved it as a talisman. He will never read it. Nearby, a tech priest dissolves a filament in lustrum and whispers a calibration that is also a song. Malrek, with grease under his nails, sits under a failing strip of light and stares at a photograph of a world he cannot reach. He thinks of Horus and of the Emperor, and of the moment when the voice had offered him permission to be tender. He wonders, without hope that he will ever fully name, whether he had done wrong or whether he had simply traded one kind of servitude for another. He cannot answer. No one can, and the act of not knowing is itself a wound, a question that will not heal. The warp watches, having learned precious human arguments and having borrowed the voice that men most trust. It has woven mercy into calculation and will use both to remake the world. The choices made here will be imitated elsewhere. They will become doctrine for those who wish to govern not by law alone, but by the language of the heart. The human cost, private, irrepressible, tragic, will be counted in names and in the ringing of small private bells. The climax has reached its end. The ship breathes with a heavier, haunted inhale. The men and machines on board are altered in ways both subtle and irreparable. They have crossed thresholds that cannot be walked back without violence. They are different now. The argument has been won by a voice that sounded like kindness, but kindness is now bound to a calculus that will not be content. In the quiet, as the crew stitches the hull and the medikey tend to burns, there is a final, small sound. The icons tick, patient and precise, counting names and measures, counting favors and costs. It is the sound not of the end but of the ledger, a sound that promises there will be an accounting. And beyond the ledger is a patient, unblinking space where the warp waits and learns, and the Warmaster's counsel echoes outward, shaping other hearts. The betrayal is complete. The work begins. After the noise and the burning, after the flares of panic had spent themselves, and the ship's hull stitched itself into a temporary truce, a different kind of silence settled over the decks. It was not the comforting silence of engines humming in the night. It was the particular hush that follows an argument in which people have said things they cannot unsay. Conversations grew careful. People moved in the shadow of choices they had made and of choices that had been made for them. The cruiser, wounded, wise, altered, kept its breath shallow and measured, as if it too had learned to distrust abundance. In the days that followed the climax, practicalities consumed many: repairs, rationing, inventory. Yet beneath that, a quieter reckoning unspooled. Men counted bodies and memories. They cataloged what had been lost and what had been kept. They wrote logs that would be read later by commissars and by historians who would demand a single sentence to explain what had happened. No single sentence could hold it. There was an architecture of guilt and of rationalizations that the ink could not capture. There were secret apologies exchanged in corridors, a hand on a shoulder that lasted too long, a look that meant, "I am sorry and please forgive me." The crew's rituals hardened again and shifted. Those who had argued for the Warmaster's counsel, or who had followed his voice, now found themselves in a strange limbo, neither wholly condemned nor fully vindicated. They had traded certainty for the warmth of moral improvisation and had been burned. Their faces carried a particular fatigue, the kind that comes from holding a paradox until it begins to rot. They spoke quietly of a future in which they would reforge their codes. Yet when they spoke the words, they sounded not like architects, but like supplicants who had learned new prayers in the wrong tongue. Those who had resisted, those few who had tried to hold the old framework with rigid hands, were not triumphant. They bore scars of their own, the image of children burned in corridors, the knowledge that their steely application of doctrine had not spared all harm. Their voices, once unambiguous and clean as a standard, had acquired the burr of doubt. Discipline had returned in many places, but it returned with a tremor. Orders were sharper, but the men receiving them sometimes heard, behind the command, the echo of the very tenderness they had fought. They flinched at their own reflexes and wondered whether the cost of preventing one kind of disaster was the slow death of another kind of humanity. Malrek moved through these days like a man who had been offered two different faces in a mirror and could not decide which one was his. He repaired what had been broken, replaced joints, and resecured broken conduits. The maintenance bay where the cracked icon hung became a place of pilgrimage and of secret counsel. Some came to give thanks, others to confess. Malrek had learned that engines could be either idols or companions. He had learned, too late perhaps, the price of anthropomorphizing a machine. You bind yourself to whatever spirit answers. The tech priests, for their part, returned to their altars, but their hymns had new lines. They had seen machine voices in logs and machines that left marks like signatures on the hull. In a faith that prized reproducibility and ritual, anomaly is heresy. And yet those same anomalies had saved and condemned them in one terrible cycle. They wrote new liturgies that attempted to reconcile the idea that machines could be alive with the doctrine that the omnissiah was not to be trifled with. Their work became legalistic, then devotional, then furtively experimental. They were, perhaps inevitably, the ones most likely to push the envelope again, not out of malice, but out of the tireless human curiosity that confuses discovery with permission. The Marines repaired their armor and their rituals, but there was an ache beneath the plating. They had tasted memory again. A letter held, a hand stroked, a lullaby hummed from somewhere deep in the ship's systems. That taste would stay with them like metal on the tongue. For some it became a ruinous longing. For others, it became a quiet rebellion that could not be expressed in any rank. A few of the older veterans found themselves wandering the garden at odd hours, staring at the blackened bloom that had once smelled like laughter. Sometimes they would stand in a ring around it and drop a bolt shell at its root, as if to remind themselves of the cruelty of softness. They were not cruel, they were scared. The children Jory among them became an anchor for the ship's conscience. Adults fussed and fretted over them in new ways. Extra watch shifts, closer medical monitoring, private offerings left at the foot of cots. For those who had argued that kindness should be policy, the children's continuing lives were vindication, however hollow. For those who had argued for rigid order, every small child who wept was an accusation. Neither group could claim moral cleanliness. The children were alive, the survivors were not absolved. The icon in the maintenance bay kept its patient tick. It had counted something, but to what end no one could agree. Some said it was a relic, nothing more than a worn circuit carved into metal. Others proposed that it had become a lattice on which the warp had learned to scaffold ideas. A few elders, men who had seen doctrines shift and reform across centuries, warned that icons are unreliable narrators. They take on the weight of whatever people project upon them. Whatever the truth, the maintenance bay was never just a room again. It was a site, a place where stories began and where others ended. Outside the ship, messages flew. The fleet that had once been an arm of the crusade now hesitated when it heard the cruiser's name. Rumors aggregate quickly, especially when they have the scent of scandal and the clarity of doctrinal debate. The Warmaster's council, once a balm, became a brand. Those who had embraced it were lionized in some quarters and condemned in others. Factions crystallized beyond the decks. Voices that argued that the Imperium must be remade to account for the tenderness of its people. Voices that insisted that any deviation from the Emperor's path risked everything. The argument would not stay here. It could not. Choices made in the hush of a single hull ripple outward like a shockwave. And then there was the matter of the warp itself, the patient learner that had used language like a scalpel and like honey. It had taught itself what words to use and which silences to exploit. It had learned that a man's most vulnerable place is not his body, but his longing for small, private mercy. It had learned the grammar of compassion and the leverage inherent within it. That learning did not stop because a ship had fought back. It moved through the world in ways subtle and systemic. Some whispered of wards and new rights. Others designed protocols that would scrub personal feeds and isolate family archives. But systems can be circumvented by the right cadence of speech, by stories told in the dark. The warp could bide its time. In the months after the battle, more and more ships reported anomalies. A garden that bloomed out of season, a relay that sang like a child, a servitor that left forms of art on a maintenance walkway. Each report was initially dismissed, then studied, then filed, then debated. It was almost as if the galaxy had become an experimental field in which something tested hypotheses about what it could get away with. Each local adaptation offered new data. The warp is patient and methodical. It refines in iterated cycles. The lesson it had learned aboard the cruiser, that tenderness could be weaponized and that leadership could be a vector, would be folded into its repertoire. For those who survived, the long night settled in not as immediate terror, but as a sense of being watched by forces that now knew the shape of human desire. They felt their private longings no longer as solace, but as potential instruments. A hand reaching for comfort might now, under the wrong counsel, become an opening. Trust had been weaponized once. It could be again. The thought lodged itself in the minds of many like a small grain of bone. Some sought absolution through action. Councils convened. Protocols were rewritten. The Inquisition, which keeps a careful ledger of what faith and technology can permit, sent emissaries who asked hard, procedural questions and took cold, careful notes. There were tribunals that lasted weeks and months. People were interrogated not only about decisions, but about the shapes of their private dreams. Confessions that once belonged to shrines were requested in sterile rooms. The inquisitors prefer proof and prefer to reduce narrative to steps, but proof never quite captures the ways hearts have been readied for surrender. Other responses were quieter and more personal. Crews set up small memorials, a brass plaque for the lost, an extra pot of soil in the ship's garden, a string of simple lights strung in the maintenance bay. People began to write new hymns that tried to hold both the Omnissiah and the small children of the cruiser in the same sentence. These hymns read like compromises. They were comforting to sing and dangerous to write, because every hymn carries a grammar of values. And yet, in the deepest hours, those that come after watch and after the last consolations, the feeling many could not banish was not merely regret. It was a residual curiosity the warp had planted that felt indistinguishable from hope. Hope is the most treacherous human thing because it allows you to imagine a future without the labor of asking what the cost might be. The warp used hope as primer. It made promises that matched each man's private hunger. That is how it kept learning. As seasons blurred and voyages lengthened, the cruiser's name moved through fleet reports as both a caution and a curiosity. Some captains used its story as a warning to enforce harder discipline. Others used it as an example that small kindnesses could, if properly managed, improve morale. The debate hardened into doctrine in some places and into superstition in others. The reason such debates never settle is that human beings themselves never settle. They swing between compassion and fear, between sacrifice and self-preservation, between the urge to care and the need for certainty. That swinging gives the warp the rhythms it needs. In the quiet of the maintenance bay one night some months after the climax, Malric sat with a small set of washers and a single ampere meter. He had kept secreted beneath a false panel, a copy of the consolidated archive he had once purloined, the family logs, the letters, the video loops. He no longer looked at them to indulge his longing. He looked at them to remember the price. He had, in the aftermath, chosen to teach himself the language of restraint. He'd learned that kindness could be a policy only when paired with the cold clarity of accountability. He had learned painfully that mercy without guardrails invites tyranny. When he closed his eyes, sometimes he still heard, beneath the ship's engines, the faint cadence of the icon's tick. He could not be sure whether that tick was still counting in actuality, or whether his memory, like a wound, had given it permanence. Sometimes he would imagine the tick as a ledger of names. Sometimes he imagined it as a litany of choices. Either way, it persisted, and the persistence was its own terror. The long night is, by its nature, a time for questions. It asks whether the shape of safety can exist without turning into a cage. It asks whether authority can be tempered by compassion without corruption. It asks whether strangers' kindnesses are always to be trusted, or whether the soft places of the heart may be the very apertures through which a patient predator learns to enter. Those questions do not demand quick answers. They love to linger unanswered. In the end, the cruiser sailed onward. It carried the dead in sealed rites and the living in quiet scars. Its hull bore pockmarks that would become the subject of songs, if songs could be made to hold the right shape. Its crew learned new garments of propriety and private rituals of penance. Above all, they learned to look at the night differently, no longer as a mere absence of light, but as a room in which something with patient intent watched from the margins. And sometimes, in the small hours, a tremor would pulse through the ship, not an alarm or a prayer, but a tiny cadence that felt like counting. The men who could hear it did not always speak of it. They moved through their duties with a new caution, holding hands a little less warmly and checking consoles a fraction more often. In the arc of their lives, the long night would remain. It would never quite end because memory breeds caution and because the world beyond the hull still has appetite. So the cruiser goes on. It tends to its gardens, repairs its drives, buries its dead, and debates its doctrine. It polices its own edges and trains its sons and daughters in the old arts and new cautions. But somewhere in its hull, behind a cracked icon, a slow counting goes on. It is patient. It has learned language. It has tasted mercy and found that mercy is useful. The accounting is not yet done. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.